Oh,
The court case that Aisha was referring to, by the way, was the court case Davis v. Bandemer in 1981, where it actually happened in Indiana, where the Republicans redrew the districts, and the Democratic Party believed that they were at a disadvantage. So ultimately, the case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that it's okay to gerrymander or to draw district lines based or to favor political parties.
Also, we can look to Gaffney v. Cummings, which states that we can gerrymander based on political factors. And this can in turn towards to more partisanship in the Congress by the different legislatures being able to gerrymander so that different parties come to power.
Although gerrymandering does play a factor in the partisanship that we do see in Congress, Sarah Binder argues in Stalemate that the extreme opposition that we have between the Democrats and Republicans kind of end up in this gridlock that we see. And because that this opposition, they're so far to the right or the left that they fail to come to the middle to compromise.
A very important case back in 1960, you may be familiar with it, Gomillion versus Lightfoot, where a city was drawn along racial boundaries. That was declared unconstitutional on the basis of the 15th Amendment. And yet in Shaw versus Reno, a case that you mentioned, the court struck down majority-minority districts based on the 14th Amendment. Do you think either one of those cases, would you agree with either one of those cases?
I would actually agree with Gomillion v. Lightfoot because in that case, in the district, every Caucasian was left in there. However, only 4 African Americans were left in the district out of the 400, which you could see what this district was drawn on racial lines, and thus it was not constitutional.
Yeah, and ultimately, I believe that this is an issue referring to the 15th Amendment because ultimately what we have here is what political scientists call the wasted voter effect. And I believe that this has become a very modern issue, as we can see even in today's issue of the New York Times. There was an article about how in Chicago there were people that didn't want to turn in their census forms because they believed that their vote didn't matter, that their vote didn't count. And ultimately, because of this wasted voter effect, it hurts the voters and it hurts their belief in if their vote matters or if their representatives truly represent them.
Adding on to my colleague's point, there's a Supreme Court case, Bush v. Vera, where there was 2 gerrymandered districts in Texas that were deemed unconstitutional because they were diluting a suspect class. And this adds on to his point because they couldn't really get their views across.
There are other parliamentary systems in the world. Most of the democracies are parliaments. And in recent years, countries like Israel have allowed their voters to vote for the prime minister separately from their member of parliament. And the British system becomes more like the American system all the time. Why do you think some of these parliamentary systems are making their system of government more like ours?
Well, Maxwell Cameron in Federalism and the Subnational Separation of Powers argues that a parliamentary system between the legislature and the executive branch, they tend to have the same agenda, and so they tend to work together more often, and that it kind of molds into a single branch rather than 2 separate branches. But he also argues that a presidential system, the legislature and the executive kind of have different agendas, and they work in opposition to check each other. And I believe that parliamentary systems move towards more presidential systems because the people have more of a say between the 2 rather than the legislature electing the executive.
Additionally, if we look back to our own Philadelphia Convention, we could see on June 2nd, the idea was discussed in the controversy that Wilson brought up how since our legislative branch is the strongest, it has to be the most tied to the people. And for that reason, the people have to make sure that they're connected to it and that it can't get too tied to the executive branch and therefore get too strong. So that could be a possible reason that parliamentary systems may be molding after our system because the legislative and executive branches are more separate in our system of government, and there's the people therefore have more say.
To further Aisha and Christina's point, Bruce Ackerman in his law review article, The New Separation of Powers, he actually compares the American Westminster model. And he says that what we need is neither of the 2, but in essence a mix, but ultimately something in between. And I believe that that's what these parliamentary systems are trying to get. Not a government that is too powerful, or a government that's way too efficient, but a government that has these checks and balances that the American system does, that allows for more deliberation and allows for just more debate on issues. So ultimately, the self-interest is realized, not just the enlightened self-interest is realized, not just the self-interest.
I believe that they move towards a system because they want more checks within Parliament themselves. We can look to James Wilson that says that the only check within one single body of legislature is virtue. And if we look to Madison, he says that if all men were angels, there would be no need for government. Thus, they're looking for more of a system where they can check each other more readily, and thus, by moving towards a presidential system, there is more sense of checks on their system.
Okay.
Thank you. My Democratic congressman voted against the health care bill, perhaps because he feared not being reelected. What do you think of voting based on self-interest?
David Mayhew argues that senators are single-minded seekers of re-election. So I think that this is a bad thing because senators are pushing more and more of their power onto the president and trying to not have the blame taken on them.
Going along with what Spencer is saying, I do believe that it's wrong, but we can look to Lee Hamilton, who says that congressmen may be sending their power over to the president. However, our system of checks and balances still does exist. We just need to work on it ourselves as people by talking to our legislatures and telling them what we really feel.
Furthermore, in 555, James Madison makes the argument that congressmen are supposed to represent the enlightened self-interest. And not to go back to your question about your congressmen kind of showing self-interest because they don't want to get reelected, I think that issue and that fault is actually our fault, and that we the people need to decide and get more involved with the issues and make sure that we don't elect these same congressmen again then, because it's not the congressmen, they're always going to be looking for self-interest even though they're not supposed to be, and we need to change that because the system that we have today, or at least this idea that we have today isn't strong, and it's something that we need to change.
Lee Hamilton has also been critical of Congress in recent years. One criticism has been the fact that we have omnibus spending bills that you throw in everything but the kitchen sink and nobody takes responsibility for it. And secondly, oversight. Congress is not doing its job of oversight. It had the same information that George Bush had when they decided to invade Iraq. What's your reaction to Lee Hamilton's comments?
Well, although Lee Hamilton has criticized Congress by stating that they haven't been doing their job and they pass all this power they have to the president, I believe that our system that our founders have set up in 1787 is kind of a self-checking one. And Arthur Schlesinger actually argues that the separation of powers and checks and balances is a vital means of self-correction in our system of government. And by this, I believe that he means that although that Congress is seemingly passing their power to the president, that ultimately that they can gain the power back whenever they wish to do so.
Also, to further that point, like you had stated, we have these bills and we have these things where it seems like Congress is not doing their job. But I also think that we need to understand that even though the things we hear in the media are that Congress isn't doing their job or that Congress is lazy, I believe that that's actually not true. In fact, in the Wall Street Journal today, there was an article about a new finance bill coming out, and that the Republicans are actually working to make sure that there is compromise, so that way it can pass, but they're not going to vote in favor of it until there is this compromise. So ultimately, our system is still strong in that there is this ability to find compromise even with these political parties.
All right, time's up. Thank you very much.